Well, hello, everybody. Welcome to Media Monday on the IBM TV network. Today, we're going to be going over some interesting concepts relating to the media. I think we're on a few media shows on the network. First of all, let's bring in several of our panelists. This person is actually a writer of The Millionaire Next Door and also the co-author of the book, Richer Than a Millionaire. Let's bring in our guest, Bill Danko. Actually, it's a panelist. Bill, welcome back. We're going to be talking about books today, so you're in the right spot. Okay. Now, also we have joining us is actually the president head of the Esports Network. We're going to bring in the president of Esports Network, Mark Themig. Mark, welcome to the show. We're going to be talking about books today, not esports.
Thanks,
on your book hat, I guess. And then we're going to bring our special guest in. He's a award-winning author. I've read quite a few of his books, and this one we're going to take a look at. Hailing in from Utah, let's bring in the Honorable Jerry Borrowman. Jerry, welcome to the show. This is your first time on Media Monday, so I'm just going to brief you who we have here. Bill Danko, who's the co-author of the book, The Millionaire Next Door and Richer Than a Millionaire. So he knows a lot about books. He sold 4 million copies, I think it was that on The Millionaire Next Door? Yeah. And then Mark Themig, who is the head of the Esports Network, which is a worldwide network on esports, which is fast growing. I've looked at that area. I'm going, it's pretty fast, esports. And we are being rebroadcast through the BBC, Al Jazeera, as well as YouTube, Facebook, LinkedIn, and Instagram, Twitter, and Twitch that I know of. So Jerry, okay, so now you're on. It's your first time here, so you're new. And I did order your book, and here it is. We're going to take a look at it. It's called 3 Against Hitler. Okay. And I had a hard time putting it down because when I started reading it, I was going, are you kidding me? This was based on a true story, and they didn't make a movie about it, which I thought was kind of interesting, or maybe there's a movie in the works. But can you tell us a little bit about yourself? You're the first time on our network, who you are, where you're from, what you do, and then we'll get into the books that you wrote.
Sure, I appreciate that, Nick. I actually work in financial services. Nick and I got together working on 412(b)(3) plans, but writing is my hobby. And it all turned on a dime 31 years ago when I helped Rudy Wabi write his amazing story of being a young German teenager in Nazi Germany during the 1930s, leading into World War II that started in 1941 or 39 for the Nazis. And it was just one of those fortuitous meetings where Rudy had this amazing story that he wanted to tell. I'd written one book that had been rejected by a publisher, and so I was feeling quite discouraged when a person at work overheard me talking and said, "You're an author?" And I said, "Well, apparently not a very good one because I'd been rejected." He says, No. He says, "You've got to meet Rudy." He says, "He's my father-in-law. He's an immigrant from Germany, and he has the most amazing story about standing up to Hitler and the Nazis, being arrested by the Gestapo, and tried for the crime of preparation to high treason." So that's how Rudy and I met each other. And after about an hour and 45-minute interview, Rudy wanted more than anything in the world to get this story out to the world. And I wanted more than anything in the world to be the one to help him do it.
Wow. Yeah. And just for the record, Dr. William Danko actually had another job also as well besides writing. Dr. Danko, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and the jobs that you had in addition to being a writer?
Well, for 35 years, I was a professor of marketing at the State University of New York at Albany. But because of that academic relationship that I had, it's where I met my co-author, my lead author, Tom Stanley. He was just a young assistant professor, and I was one of his students. And he invited me to participate in his very first project on the affluent market. So that goes way back to 1973. And so for the past, 50 years about, I've been working on this same topic, and it was all started by a fortuitous meeting, perhaps just like you had, Jerry. You know, you had this opportunity for someone to tell a story.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and the thing is, I think it's a great story. I actually was able to get this book, but it was hard to find. I was able to order on Amazon, and I got a used copy. I'm going like, this is really tough. The other one that I ordered, I wasn't even able to get. It was that difficult. The other one, the other book that we talked about that you wrote. But since I did get this and I did read through it, honestly, Jerry, I couldn't put it down because I could not believe the story never got out. But could you tell our viewers a little bit about the story, Three Against Hitler? It is based on a real story. So I thought it was pretty cool. Tell us a little about the story.
Thank you. So Rudy Wabi, Karl-Heinz Schnibbe, and a young man named Helmut Hubener were friends at church. And the thing that distinguished them from most Germans boys growing up at the time is that because they belonged to an American-based church, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, they had American missionaries coming into their neighborhood and meeting with them on a regular basis. So while the Nazis ruthlessly controlled the media, these boys had a connection to the United States that convinced them as war broke out that Hitler was pursuing an evil path that would bring destruction upon the Germans. Helmut Hubener was the lead person in the little group that they formed. He was a man who was judged to have an IQ in the genius range. He wrote a paper once that was published and discussed at his trial, in which he talked about German legal profession. The Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of Germany said that if a law school student had submitted that same article to him, he would have given it an A+. So Helmut had this brilliant mind, but he worried that the Germans were being led in the wrong direction. So using a church typewriter that he had access to, and whenever I tell this story to young people, this amuses me and puzzles them. He started writing pamphlets by listening to the British broadcasting system, and then he would write up pamphlets that told the truth about what was happening in the war and to the people in Germany. And the way that he did is that he'd insert carbon paper between up to 10 pages, type on the typewriter. Well, there isn't a kid under the age of 40 who's heard of carbon paper, because now you just push print and print as many copies as you want. Rudy and his friend Karl-Heinz Schnibbe would then take these handbills that they'd prepared and they would distribute them surreptitiously in their working class neighborhood of Hamburg, Germany. So, for example, Rudy would go to the opera, and the Germans loved their opera house. And while the opera was performing, Rudy would sneak in and put these handbills, there were ultimately 26 of them written, in the coat pockets of the patrons, so that when they came out and reached in their pocket, here would be this anti-Nazi propaganda, I suppose you'd call it, but it was based on the truth as heard through the British broadcasting system. Well, it drove the Gestapo crazy that there was this little resistance cell going on inside of Hamburg. And that's ultimately what led to the arrest first of Helmut, then Karl-Heinz, and finally Rudy Wabi, because they were accused of preparing to commit treason.
Yeah, it was like sedition or what they're really doing. But what got me, Jerry, when I was reading through this is, first of all, they actually had a legal system over there during World War II, during World War II, and they actually prosecuted. These were children; they were like in their 15s and 16-year-olds. Can you tell us about how their legal system worked? And the crime was, from what I understand, distributing handbills. Correct?
That's exactly what the crime was, and handbills were critical of the Nazi government. So they first Helmut was found at work. He was betrayed by apparently every working place in Germany had a political overseer in the office who reported directly to the Nazi party. And if they saw any sort of activity that they considered suspicious, they would report it. So Helmut had been talking with someone trying to broaden the distribution of these handbills. This was passionate for him. He did this because he believed that Hitler was destroying Germany. He was turned in. He was arrested by the Gestapo. He was tortured. And finally, he revealed that he had been assisted by Karl-Heinz Schnibbe, another of the three boys. Karl-Heinz was arrested. Rudy went to church on Sunday. His two best friends have been arrested by the Gestapo. He's terrified. And one of the young women said, "They're coming for you next, Rudy." Well, he thought about trying to escape to Holland, but he realized that if he did, they would arrest his mother and her second husband and put their lives at great risk. So he held out until he was arrested. The Gestapo tortured him mercilessly. They used both the good cop, bad cop on him, but they finally got him to confess that he had distributed these handbills. And this brought him to stand before what, and I won't say this correctly, but it's the Volksgerichtshof, which is the People's Court, which was specifically instituted as the highest court in Germany to suppress political dissent. So they had all the other legal issues going on, property rights and everything that our system does. But the primary purpose of the courts was to promote the Nazi regime. Well, the day comes and they're told that they have to go before what was called the Blood Tribunal. And it was named that for a couple of reasons. First of all, the justices wore blood red robes with the Nazi emblem, the swastika with an eagle perched above it, which the people who stood before the court called the vulture of impending doom, and they had to explain themselves. Well, the trial was something of a sham because even their defenders said they were guilty, and the prosecutors were able to bring out the 26 handbills that had been produced. And as the trial began to unfold, Helmut Hubener, who was the middle of the three boys in terms of age, realized that they were going to be convicted. So he began to intentionally goad the justices and to test them. And he'd say things like, "Do you really believe that we can possibly win this war now that America has come in? Do you realize that Hitler is going to destroy our country?" Well, this sent them into a rage. And of course, what he was doing was trying to draw the wrath of the court on himself to protect his two friends, because he realized that he had now put their lives at risk. The outcome of the trial was they were all found guilty. Helmut was condemned to death by guillotine. Karl-Heinz Schnibbe, 5 years for his role, and Rudy to 10 years in prison at hard labor for his role in distributing these pamphlets. In what to me is the most poignant scene of the book, as the trial ended, Rudy was put in a cell with Helmut, where they had about 5 to 10 minutes to talk. And Rudy said, "Helmut, the Nazi or the Hitler Youth has appealed for clemency for you. The justices have said that they hope you get clemency despite their sentence. But the only one who could set aside his conviction was Adolf Hitler himself." And Helmut pointed to the wall where people had scrawled their last living testament, having been convicted by the court. And Helmut said, "Rudy, there is no hope for me. I hope there is hope for you." Well, Rudy had been put in that cell by accident because he was supposed to be taken to a different place. And as he got up to leave, he hugged Helmut one last time. And that was the last time he ever saw his friend. Helmut ultimately was executed by guillotine at the Neuengamme prison camp. And he is the youngest member of the resistance to have been put to death at the hands of the Nazis.
And also, it seems to me it was pretty brutal how they did that guillotine. They had this black cover where no one could see the guillotine. And they sat the guy next there, and all of a sudden they pulled the black cover back. There's the guillotine, stuck him in there, and like in 30 seconds, they chopped the person's head off. It was like a real fast thing. But what really got me about the book, Jerry, is that when you see all the shows in World War II, it's always us against the Nazis. What that book demonstrated, there was a whole group of people over there that they weren't in favor of the Nazis at all. They were stuck in a very difficult situation. Can you tell us about these people in Hamburg, especially, that were stuck between a rock and a hard place? What did the Nazis do to control these people that were basically anti-Nazis?
Well, so Rudy was able to share with me some great stories out of his own life. One thing, they would do things in public. So one of the things that first outraged Rudy is he and his family went to a Jewish doctor who they really appreciated. One day they went and it said, no Jews allowed, and the doctor had been sent off to a concentration camp. The second thing that they did is they would do things in public. So he was walking down the street one day, and a Jewish proprietor who owned a store that they had traded with his whole life, all of the glass in his window had been broken out. The proprietor and his family had been dragged out to the street where they were being beaten publicly by the SS troops. And then Rudy said, and what to me was the ultimate indignity, as they were lying there in agony, bleeding, the Nazis urinated on them. Well, anyone who sees such a thing knows that if we cross these people, it is going to be terrible for us. One of the stories that resonated most with me is that a man by the name of Solomon Schwartz had been a member of Rudy's congregation, and someone turned him into the Gestapo. Rudy thought he knew who that was, but they said that he was part Jew. Well, what happened is that at the end of World War I, Solomon's mother had been raped by someone from the Soviet Union. So he was brought up, and she was Jewish. The person who raped her undoubtedly was not. But the court decided that only a Jew would rape a Jew, so therefore he must be 100% Jewish. So they sent him off to a concentration camp. This again terrifies the people in the church because they see what happens if you cross the Nazis. And then do we have time for one more quick story?
Yeah, sure. Get it.
There was a member of their ward. He was older and he was very outspoken. He was what I view as many Germans, he was just very plain speaking. And one day he was walking down the street and he looked up and he said, oh, they've built another statue to one of those Nazi murderers or Nazi butchers. Well, someone heard him, turned him in. He was arrested and sent to what they called a re-education camp. And a re-education camp was a concentration camp that didn't lead to death necessarily, but they would torture the people who were in there so that they would not resist the government. And one of the things that he said they did is in the middle of the night, they woke all of the prisoners up. It was the middle of winter. They took them outside, stripped all their clothes off so that they were naked. They bound their hands behind their back. They poured cold water on their hands until ice formed. And then they came by and beat their hands with a truncheon to warm the hands, is what they said. Well, he was gone for 6 months to this concentration camp. And when he came back, he made it to church, but he was trembling. So Rudy and Helmut grabbed him and took him aside and said, what on earth happened to you? And at first he couldn't even talk about it because he was terrified they would come for him again. But finally he told him some of these experiences that had happened. And you know, they tried to comfort him as best they could. But ultimately 2 weeks after this happened, he passed away because the trauma had been so significant. One of the things I've learned, so I've now had 20 books published. 10 of them are nonfiction biography, I think inspirational biography. 10 are novels, mostly from World War I and World War II. One of the things I've learned in all the research I've done for those books, Nick, is that if you want to terrorize a population, you'll go into an apartment building in the middle of the night, because when people are asleep, it's very disorienting to be awakened suddenly. So you're sitting you're in an apartment building and suddenly you hear a noise in the hallway, you come to, and the Nazis would break in, they would go in and arrest someone and publicly drag him out, making as much noise and fuss as they could, so that all the other residents of that apartment building were terrified by the thought of that happening to them. So there were many devices that were used to keep the population in control, and this is what outraged Rudy and his friend Helmut.
Yeah. Okay. Well, we'll go to our panelists and see what they think. Bill Danko, I like how you did your book because, like I said, it was originally called Marketing the Affluent. Then they changed the name literally to The Millionaire Next Door, and then it's sold 4 million copies. I thought it was pretty cool. But what do you think about this book? I know you probably haven't read it yet. I had to drag through it. 3 Against Hitler. You've heard Jerry's story. What are your thoughts since you're a New York Times best-selling author?
Yeah. No, first of all, fascinating recounting of history. my father in World War II was in the Asian Pacific theater in the Navy, but my father-in-law earned 5 Bronze Stars, mostly, I think, from the Battle of the Bulge. I mean, so certainly there was a huge American effort to, bring Hitler to justice and the Nazi regime. But I do know there are a lot of, I would call these the underground, who would be the silent resistance, or not so silent in this case, who certainly were not Nazis. They were Germans who loved their country and they loved their culture. And, one of my friends who recently died, he was a pastor of the Berlin Lutheran Church. And he did quite a bit of archival work looking at the, what the religious, in this case Lutherans, were doing to try to stymie and work against the Nazi efforts. So, yeah, I applaud this kind of historical lesson because, I think we have to wake up our current population to what we have is this cancel culture. Right. And saying, your thoughts are not allowed. So I think history will repeat itself if we just don't learn anything from it. Yeah. So, Jerry, I applaud your approach to this. Now we just have to get people to start believing that it can happen again.
Can happen again. Yes, I'll pick on Mark. I know he heads up the esports network, so there's a lot outside of his territory. But what are your thoughts about books like this? In other words, 3 Against the Nazis.
I really agree with what Bill was saying there. That a lot of our young people, our school system, I think, has failed a lot of our young people, quite frankly. Just being blunt about it. I don't think that a lot of young people really understand history. They don't understand the sacrifices that were made to both keep our country free, but to liberate and keep other countries free. And I think books like this that tell compelling stories about the kind of sacrifices and suffering and things that went on, are valuable and important to be in these school libraries, because I'm not sure, how history is being taught today, but I've certainly rarely run across young people that have a firm grasp on even just the last 100 years. I mean, just the last 100 years, which isn't really a long time, especially as you get older, you realize, that it's not a long time. And so I think to understand some of the most important and critical events, I mean, this is no small event that happened in world history and our history. And yet I think most teenagers and young people are really quite unaware of most of this. So I really, my hat's off, for this incredible book and the story that's being told in such a, important manner and way. I just hope that it becomes a book that could be in school libraries, so we have this perspective. I lived in Russia for a couple of years when I was working with the General Motors distributor for the former Soviet Union, and my office was in the Izvestia publishing house, and it was directly across from the Museum of the Revolution at that time, which I had a chance to see every day because I go look out my window and see it, but go in and visit it as well. And here again, I think that's another means of conveying some of our history that is probably not being well used at the moment by a lot of young people. Obviously, COVID has had some impact, significant impact on museums, but museums also contain tremendous cultural references and understanding that I think are important for all of us to know about and visit.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Mark, what are your thoughts? 3 Against the Nazis. heard about the book, and seems to be that some of these problems still exist, especially in the United States, where we have
Well,
no knock warrants.
yeah, no knock warrants, and there's things that were probably even borrowed, unfortunately, from the Nazi system and other systems that have existed that were repressive and everything. But I must commend the author for the book, because it is definitely a historical book, and I agree that to my other mark, that there's a lot of things that folks that are much younger, and I'm in my late 50s, don't necessarily know. I actually know what carbon paper was, and I've actually had the privilege of using some carbon paper in the past, so I know what carbon paper is like, being in that media space, and also having even know what a teletype is, because I remember I worked at a African American newspaper, and we had the teletype when the Challenger explosion happened that actually let us know about that incident, which many years ago. And a lot of folks that are kids now don't even know what the Challenger explosion was, or about those astronauts that also passed away during that incident. So you're right, a lot of these stories are not covered. I know that a lot of times people think about the kind of the dual thing that was happening, and I didn't know about the resistance partially from watching movies and TV shows. They touched on it on one of my favorite shows, even though it was kind of a spoof show and everything, that being Hogan's Heroes and things of that nature. So they definitely touched on the resistance and everything. And I've also watched some movies, including an episode of Star Trek that, if I remember correctly, also touched on the resistance movement as well, even though that was set as a science fiction number. But people forget that there's all these stories that were going on, because a lot of the African American soldiers were even finding that while they were fighting for freedom, and y'all are all correct in terms of trying to not have that atrocity happen in Germany, when they came back, were not getting the greetings that they thought that they deserved. And I think that they also deserved, because many of them were heroes over there across the pond. But when they came back, they did not always get the respect, because we were in the middle of the whole segregation kind of struggles that were going on during that time. So that was another story that is a lot of times for friends of mine and relatives oftentimes talk about, is how they were treated when they came back, sometimes even coming back to segregated theaters and not being treated well by the police officers and all of that. I sometimes, and it comes back to something that Nick said, I sometimes wonder if some of the things that happened to our 60s leaders might not have been because of some of those same kind of lessons that were learned about attacking people late night and things of that nature. Because we do know that some of the civil rights leaders were arrested and or in some cases killed because they were gotten and attacked in the very wee hours of the morning while they were asleep, or while they were having other things. I'm thinking about even some of the members of the Black Panthers that happened to as well. So definitely it is a story that needs to be told, and I commend you for the book, and I look forward to reading it, because I am going to try to get a copy of it myself, and I'm also going to try to read some of your other books as well, because I'm a big buff of history and love reading things in that context. So that's some of my immediate thoughts.
Thank you.
Yeah, Bill.
Yeah. Now, Jerry, here are three ordinary people in this resistance and laying down their lives to save others. This is in the same theme of, Maximilian Kolbe, who I think he became a saint, but, and the book I think I read about him, Tortured for Christ, that, he was just part of that resistance, and he gave up his life so that others could live. So, I mean, this is really a story about remarkable courage. And that's it, remarkable courage and doing the right thing. And these are just ordinary guys who did it.
Another great book that people enjoy is Corrie ten Boom's book.
Yeah.
She was taken prisoner and held in very terrible conditions, and how her faith blossomed really under that adversity, and she was able to make a powerful difference in the world. As I listened to each of you comment on the book, it just reminds me that, so when I wrote the book, I was just so inspired, and if you could see Rudy, you would just know he had this almost glow to him. He worked as a machinist. He was a master machinist, and yet he was always willing to stand up to leadership and to authority if he thought it was taking away people's freedom. And that carried throughout the rest of his life. Sort of a sad part of the story is we signed the contract to publish the book in 1991, and Rudy passed away a week later from cancer. So he never got to see the book in print, but he knew it was going to be published. And his whole motive for telling the story was to pay tribute to Helmut, his friend from childhood who had such courage. When I had children, I began to look at it a little differently, because can you imagine being these boys' parents and realizing that they had decided to do something like take on and challenge the Nazis? And so Nick had asked, how did the Nazis manage the population? Well, whenever someone did something that was against the government, they not only went after them, but they often threatened their family.
Right.
One of the stories I told, if we have time, that to me is extremely inspiring, was Colonel von Choltitz, who was the last commander of Paris during World War II. He had been a very faithful Nazi leader in the German army. And when he got to Paris, Hitler ordered him to prepare for the destruction of all the iconic monuments of Paris, including the Eiffel Tower, the Louvre Museum, all of the great history that is attached to Paris. They actually placed bombs under all of them so that he could destroy Paris. But as von Choltitz began to understand and appreciate that, A, the Nazis were losing the war and that it would ultimately end in defeat, and secondly, that to destroy much of the record of civilization would be a crime against humanity, he began a stalling action until, and this is the part that to me was so inspiring for him. We're talking about a Nazi general who gave word to the Swedish ambassador that if he could get word out to the Americans, they could take the city of Paris with very little resistance. It had been Eisenhower's intent to bypass Paris and to drive forward with full energy to get to Germany first, leaving the Parisians exposed. But von Choltitz said, I can't hold it off much longer. The city will be destroyed unless Eisenhower does something. So they actually rode on a bicycle through enemy lines to get to the Americans to tell them this. And Hitler called him, Colonel von Choltitz, and said, is Paris burning? Is Paris burning? There's been a movie made of it that maybe you have heard. But think of the courage it took, because what he realized is that his family back home, his wife and his children, were subject to the Nazis taking them and torturing them because of his resistance or his stalling tactic to save the city of Paris. All of this is something that to me is sort of terrifying. It's one thing for me to be courageous, but it's another for me to expose all the people I love to that kind of, and yet there are so many wonderful examples of people who are willing to do that because they believe freedom matters.
Mm-hmm.
Yep. And it seems to me that was one of their ways they controlled the population, is through terrorism. In other words, they terrorized everybody, and then they put people, if you don't agree with them, in concentration camps. But also it looks like Rudy had a trip to the Eastern Front for a little while, and then he got retransported back to the Western Front because they were losing the war with Russia. Can you tell us about, I thought it was pretty interesting, his trip to the Eastern Front and then back to the Western Front.
Yeah, so as he was moved to the various prison camps, Rudy did not behave well. I mean, he made friends with all the people he was working with directly, but if the Nazis were to ever challenge him, he would stand up to them. So towards the end of the war, and it's sort of complicated, so I'll do my best to unravel it for you. So Rudy is in Poland, and he's working in an aircraft factory, and he's been assigned to do this. Well, some of the prisoners wanted to sabotage the German Messerschmitt planes so that they would fail in flight, because that would be a way to support the war effort. Rudy felt that to kill another German who was simply doing his duty was not the right thing to do. So he's in this camp, and then as the Russians began to advance, they moved him back closer to Hamburg, where he was in a prisoner of war camp. Well, the Nazis were in serious trouble now. They were being closed in from the east by Russia. The Americans were advancing from the west. The British were coming in from the north, and of course the southern flank was being threatened from Italy. So Germany is being enclosed. And paradoxically, to us in retrospect, that makes it obvious they were losing the war. But as you shorten your lines, you become stronger because you're defending less and less territory. And so the threat of the Nazis was very great. And there was a fear that they had developed a nuclear or an atomic weapon. And Hitler was, in fact, promising the people that he had a dreadful weapon that would end the war by destroying London. So this is the circumstance in which Rudy is brought back to a concentration camp. Well, they're running out of soldiers because so many are being captured, particularly on the Eastern Front. So an SS recruiting officer comes to their camp and says, "You are all political prisoners who have betrayed the motherland. We are going to give you the opportunity to redeem your honor so that when our inevitable victory is achieved, you can return to society with full citizenship and honors." Well, the prudent thing to do would be to go along with that. And Karl-Heinz Schnibbe actually did go. He was taken and he was sent to a frontline unit in the Eastern Front. He was captured by the Russians and spent an extra 5 years in a Soviet prison in the Gulag system before he was returned. But Rudy stood up and he looked at the SS officer. And what you need to understand about the SS is they were recruited as children. They were raised in essentially a barrack system, and they were fanatical supporters of Hitler. So for them, losing the war was the worst possible thing that could happen. It was the end of their life as they understood it. So this Nazi recruiter is standing there and he points to Rudy and he says, "So will you serve?" And Rudy said, "I wouldn't help the Nazis when they were winning the war. Why on earth would I help them when they are losing the war?" Well, this SS officer was so furious, he pointed a gun straight at Rudy's head and was about to pull the trigger when one of the prison guards stepped between Rudy and this SS officer. And he said, "Rudy's a little crazy in the head. He doesn't know what he's saying." And that man saved Rudy's life, potentially at the risk of his own, which simply shows there were many good people in Germany who were doing things that they didn't want to do because the alternative was horrible, and yet they did the best they could. To me, that was an inspiring story that this guard saved Rudy's life. It also described the Rudy that I knew. He would not back down when it came to something that he considered principle.
Yeah, I thought that was pretty impressive. And then finally, it seems to me the Americans got into Hamburg and they opened up the prisons and they had to interview Rudy to find out whether they would release him or not. So what did Rudy do when the Americans got there? Now they're interviewing the prisoners.
Okay, so you've got to remind me of that one, Nick, because I haven't read that chapter just recently.
The thing is, they want to know what you're in there for. In other words, they said, what are you in prison for? And he goes, "Well, my crime was distributing anti-Nazi literature."
Yeah.
And they go, "Sounds good to me, mate." I think it was a Brit who did it.
Yeah, it was a
Brit.
British.
Go. In other words, that was a good thing that you were in prison for. I found that to be quite interesting because then all of a sudden now, as a practical purpose, he had to return back to his family, and they're in a war-torn Hamburg. In other words, it was he went from a bad situation to, frankly, another bad situation. In other words, where Hamburg was bombed out, and it was pretty terrible. But I don't think in the United States we get this viewpoint, Jerry, of the internal parts of Germany. In other words, we're always given a line that all the people in Germany were Nazis, all the people were SS troopers, all the people were in line with Hitler. In the reality, it doesn't seem that way. It seems like he had a lot of people that just weren't for him, but there was very little they can do. Tell us about that. Part
of it is that one of the things that Rudy helped me understand more than any other, of all the history that I've read, is that the Treaty of Versailles at the end of World War I was extremely punitive to the German people.
Mhm.
So up until that point in time, the history of war is that the vanquished country had to pay harsh reparations to repay the countries who had defeated them for the cost of the war. Well, what that did is it condemned Germany to bankruptcy, and they had inflation. There's a wonderful story about inflation that Rudy shared with me. The inflation, so the Allies at the end of World War I negotiated for the repayment of Germany's war debt in Reichsmarks, but they didn't set it to be adjusted for inflation. So when Hitler took over, he simply inflated the German economy nearly 1 billion%, and he repaid the Americans with worthless notes. The story is that a fellow comes walking up to a grocery store with a wheelbarrow full of Reichsmarks, and he sets this wheelbarrow down and goes into the store to buy what he's coming. And when he comes out, the Reichsmarks are there, but the wheelbarrow has been stolen, because that's the only thing that had value. There was no value to the money. So Rudy and the world that he grew up in is that Hitler came in and he was going to restore dignity to Germany. He put people to work. He started getting people jobs. He created economic activity. So in the beginning, people were really fans of Hitler. And they had a grudge against the Allies who had beaten them in World War I. They felt that the war ended unfairly. And so Hitler was really a very popular fellow. It was only later that people began to understand what he was doing to Jewish people with the Holocaust. It was only later that they began to understand that this, he played everybody against everybody. And that was one of the ways that you dominate a population again, is you get groups that compete with each other. So Jews were terrible. Anybody from Central Europe, the Slavs, the Poles, the Roma people, all of those were to be despised. And Hitler created the society did based on resentment and conflict. So
Hey, Jerry, along those same lines, I was wondering what you think Rudy would think about this, because, like I said, I've got friends that have been definitely involved in various civil rights struggles, and my dad was actually involved with a lot of things in the 60s and everything. And there seems to be, even in this day, in the 21st century, almost like this kind of comparison of horrors. I guess that's the best way to describe it and everything, where people are like, saying that, what happened to the Germans and particularly the Jewish community was definitely a atrocity, and there was no doubt that it was an atrocity. But then people will start making parallels where they'll be like, but yes, that was an atrocity, but my atrocity of slavery was worse than yours, or my atrocity of the Trail of Tears was worse than yours. And there becomes kind of this kind of almost battle of the atrocities as to what was worse than the other. And I'm just wondering what you think Rudy's reaction would be to that, because I do see that happen consistently when you have conversations with people in that political minds set.
Yeah, so I think that's a very interesting observation that you've made, and it's certainly something that has puzzled me through the year. How we take a group that is oppressed, and you would think that they would be the group that would have the most empathy for others who are oppressed, but instead they somehow are competitive with them. I honestly don't know what Rudy would think of that. What I do know is this: Rudy was constantly and consistently opposed to the use of state power to favor one group over another. He was consistently opposed to any sort of authoritarian system that told people what they should believe, how they should behave, how they should live their lives. He was kind of close to being a libertarian. Government is there to provide protection and an economic system, but otherwise people should be able to act in the ways that they think are in their best interest.
Yeah, that makes sense. Do you know if he ever did any? Because I'm thinking about like some of the great civil rights leaders. Like I know Martin Luther King wrote the letters from the jail from Birmingham and everything. But I was wondering, do you know if he did any kind of newsletter or any sort of resistance work, even when he was in the jail cell? I haven't had a chance to read the book, but I know a lot of what he did was as a kid. But I was wondering, did he do any when he was inside of the system as well?
No, there was really no opportunity for them once they were. First of all, they'd learned that Helmut had been executed, and that was devastating to them. And secondly, they were in a place where everything was monitored and world events were simply beyond them. What I will tell you this, to the credit of the German people, is that after the war, the Germans have been meticulous in trying to reveal their history to the world and to their own people, and to stomp out all remnants of Nazism. And so Helmut Hubener has been honored as a hero of the state of Germany. They've named a hotel after him, a youth facility after him. They invited Karl-Heinz and Rudy to come back to Hamburg as guests of the Hamburg Senate, it's called, which would be the city council. And they were given a Freedom Award, and they were taken to the cities. And so within Germany itself, this story is really well known, whereas in America, it's unknown because it's just one of millions of stories from the war. And Nick said it earlier, we tend to view things from our point of view as the Americans coming in to liberate. But in Germany, this story of Helmut Hubener, and they call it the Hubener Group, is very well known, and they are honored for that. And so I was glad to bring it to the United States as best we could. So that I hope that answers the question.
No, that did. And to Nick's point and everything, I definitely think that a lot of times we don't even think about when we think about education, the education system, the importance of newsletters and just how much newsletters have actually played an important part of many struggles. I mean, now you can go to anything from like the women's rights movement and a number of the folks that were doing newsletters to Frederick Douglass and how he used newsletters, and a number of other folks that were using newsletters and handbills as a way to get the message out to whatever the government was that people were arguing against. Because I just know that that's been a vital part of our history that we don't talk about, even when we study media. But that newsletter has been a powerful tool, and I would say used definitely all the way back since our founding, meaning the founding of the United States, and even in other parts of the world, like in England and other parts, that they have used that newsletter. And I can think of many historical ones, like I know Ben Franklin had a newsletter, Frederick Douglass had one, I believe Thomas Jefferson and Thomas Paine had their own newsletter. So a lot of times we don't even think about the importance of that aspect to getting the words out and to putting principles out there as well.
Yeah.
One of the things that Karl-Heinz or that Helmut Hubener did that I thought was amusing, and so did Rudy, when he did these handbills, which would be the equivalent of the newsletter that you're talking about, Mark. So he would listen, and for example, the Royal Oak is a British battleship that the Germans claimed they had sunk 3 times, and yet the BBC put out news and they showed pictures still floating, despite what the German propaganda says. So Helmut wrote a sort of sarcastic little handbill about this, but what he'd do is he'd put a swastika in the upper corner, he'd print it on red paper, and then Rudy and Karl-Heinz would go around the city of Hamburg and they would post this to the official Nazi bulletin board. So people come up wanting to see what the latest news is, and here's this handbill that they start reading, and then it's like, oh my gosh, what is this about? And so that goes along with what you talk about.
Yeah. The thing that I found very interesting about the book is when Hitler wanted to solve his reparations, he just printed money and sent it over. And of course, that created the hyperinflation. When you read about it, at least when I was reading about Hitler, hyperinflation, it just kind of happened and there was hyperinflation. But they don't show basically the background of why there was hyperinflation. It was really printing money and handing it to it. Then also we know this reproduces itself. Turkey recently did the same thing, Jerry. Yeah. They have printed money and handed it over, and now Turkey is experiencing hyperinflation. Venezuela did the same thing. So we've seen other countries solve their debt problem by this, I'm just going to print a bunch of money and hand it over. but does that solve the problem, Jerry?
Well, one of the things that it did for Germany that is much more insidious than simply repaying the Allies, because what we learned at the end of World War II with the Marshall Plan is that the victor is the only one who has the resources to help rebuild the world. And so the United States, for the first time in history, sent money to the vanquished country to help them rebuild. And that set us apart from every other major player in world history. The Japanese people are very, my son lived there for 2 years, and they're a very closed society, not very open to outsiders. But they were so astonished that the United States would pay to rebuild their economy that they still have gratitude towards the US. Well, I tell you that story because what Hitler did in hyperinflating the economy is he bankrupted the middle class. Mm-hmm. So if you think about it, everybody who had money in a bank, when you have hyperinflation, your savings, your life savings become worthless. Mm-hmm. Your pension becomes worthless. Everything that you have built your financial security on has no value because it has diminished in purchasing power. And in that way, you become dependent on the government going forward. Meanwhile, the people who own property, the people who own the gun manufacturing facilities, all of the factories, those people retain their wealth, but they are now appreciative of what the government has done, and they realize the government can nationalize them at any time. And so once again, you can use economic policy as a way to control and manipulate people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and the other thing is they used racism to also generate people to be behind the Nazis. In other words, there's a disparagement of races. And it seems to me that it's like, let's go to the most common denominator in it. And Hitler went to that, and he knocked the Jews, the Slavs, and the Poles. Yeah. You know, in other words, all of a sudden they're all bad people and we're all good people type of stuff. How does that seem to appeal to the Germans? Why were they so happy with this type of deal?
Why does it appeal to many Americans? I mean, there's always a boogeyman, isn't there?
Right.
There's always someone who's taking my jobs. There's always someone who's exploiting my income for their wealth. This is something that has happened in every society that I can think of. The Romans did it. Mm-hmm. The Greeks did it. We just have this sense of nationalism, and Hitler was a master at using those tools to build these resentments against other people. Mm-hmm. And it's really unique for someone to see through that, which is why, so Rudy didn't come up with the idea of doing handbills, and Karl-Heinz Schnibbe didn't come up with the idea. It was this young man, Helmut Hubener, who, from a religious point of view, he declared that he believed Hitler to be an antichrist. An antichrist is a term that comes out of the New Testament, mm-hmm. of someone who opposes the principles of Christianity and kindness. And it was because of his ability to penetrate through all of the propaganda around him and to say, no, this is wrong. And he wasn't the only one, but he was one. That's what enabled him to take this position that he did, that ultimately cost him his life, but ultimately cost the German people their country.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because they tend to support it. But as we're winding down, can you just tell our audience a little bit about the other books that you wrote and the awards that you won? I know that you got quite a few of them. Can you just tell us a little bit about your?
Yeah. So this is a book that I had also talked about.
That's the one I couldn't get. It was sent back. I don't know how. I went. Amazon sent it, and then they said, "Well, we don't have it." And they weren't able to get it. But talk us about Compassionate Soldier.
I don't know why they had that problem, and makes me feel bad.
Yeah.
So I've written 4 co-authored biographies. I wrote a book with Bernie Fisher, who won the Congressional Medal of Honor in Vietnam. He's professional Air Force who risked his life to save another man, and that's why he won the Medal of Honor. I wrote a book called A Distant Prayer about a fellow who served on a B-17 bomber, was shot down over Poland, taken prisoner of war, and had these amazing miracles that preserved his life, and a very powerful story of what it was like to be a prisoner of war in World War II. And then, so I have 10 nonfiction books. Compassionate Soldier was the first. It's a collection of stories that talks about people who served in the resistance, and it won Forward Reviews as a national publication that reviews books, and it won the 2017 Best in War and Military. Rudy and I won and this was very meaningful to me. There's an association called the Freedoms Foundation at Valley Forge that was created to honor people who served the cause of freedom. The first recipient was Dwight D. Eisenhower. And Rudy and I were given the gold medal national award 4-3 against Hitler because they felt that it did a great job of showing how people will stand up on behalf of freedom. And so those are some of the awards that I've won, but I just love history. I love finding these stories of people that are not well-known stories, but that I think ought to be well-known,
Right.
and trying to bring them to the public.
Yeah. Well,
I need to say this before we end this.
Yeah.
The Millionaire Next Door had a profound influence in my life.
There we go.
Became aware of it 30 years ago, and I have used the principles in that book to make my financial situation much better. And I work with very high net worth people, and so thank you very much for that, Bill Danko.
Yeah, it was a great book. He's got a new one out, Richer Than a Millionaire. If you haven't got that one, get this book for certain.
Thank you.
But it also had a profound impact on my life too, as well. I always think when I do something financial, I go, what would the Millionaire Next Door do?
Yeah.
You know?
Well,
Yeah.
Jerry, first of all, thank you for that. Yeah, you talk about the hyperinflation. I mean, do you see the parallel now? I mean, we're going to just in the United States print a lot of money, keep interest rates artificially low, penalize savers.
Yeah, history tends to repeat itself unless you read it. You know, so
how else are we going to pay off our national debt if we increase interest rates?
Right. Yeah.
You know,
you can't. You got to keep the interest rates down.
Got to keep it going, definitely.
And this is what it means to be richer than a millionaire. It's not about the money. It's about your value system. It's about how you're a giver.
Right.
It's what's in your heart.
Good book.
Yeah.
Get Richer Than a Millionaire.
Yeah, I want to get Richer Than a Millionaire. I want to get Bill Danko's book. That's on my book list as well, even though I've got some books behind me and everything.
This one's hard to get, by the way.
I'm gonna have to find a way to get it. I'm gonna manage to do it some kind of way or another, but I'm gonna definitely get that book. I did see that one of your other books, I know we're winding down, was on the Great Depression. I was just wondering, do you think we're heading into another one of those as we're winding down? Because I know Bill's got the book about Richer Than a Millionaire. When I was looking up your bio, I was like, oh, he wrote a book about the Depression. And some people say we're heading to another one, but I was wondering your thoughts, Jerry.
You know, what I try to do in my own life and with the clients that I work with is you just try to stay ahead of it. So ownership is better than loanership.
Bingo.
Having assets is more important. I belong to a church that teaches that you should have a year's supply of food on hand and other essentials. Food in the basement that you paid $1 for that now costs you $3 is worth $3. So you just try to be as prudent as you can. And I will say this: I believe America is and remains a great country with incredible economic potential.
Yep.
And I don't understand how all of the debt is. I think it's very good that we kept the economy going during the pandemic. Should we slow it down now? Probably. I don't think we're headed for another Great Depression. If anything, the trends are now is that we can't find enough workers to fill the jobs. And so that's a much better situation to be in than what we were then.
Right.
Yeah,
And with that, we're at the hour, so I do want to thank our special guest, Jerry Borrowman, who's author of, if you try to get this book, 3 Against Hitler. Should be a movie, but that's my own opinion. And
we got filmmaking friends. We're going to make it into a movie.
Bill Danko, Richer Than a Millionaire. Yeah, I know. Well, we do have some people who can make it into a movie, but I really think it should be. But we want to thank our special guests and our viewers around the world from Lithuania, Al Jazeera, and the BBC. We'll see you next time on Media Monday. Until then, take care.
Don't forget the vote special.